Hello and welcome to Vermont Film Essentials. My name is Lincoln L. Hayes.
I'm David Metzger.
Joining us again is our old buddy Devon Ewalt.
What's going on?
Joining us to talk about Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now? Yes, Apocalypse Now. Not
And
then
forever.
or later.
Not
Apocalypse
Redux.
Now.
Now.
The original, the OG, we made sure that Devon and I were both under the impression that we had seen Redux. But then upon watching, we're like, oh, no, wait.
I wasn't. No,
no?
I just had never attempted to watch it, and then did not want to watch it for this.
I think my confusion is that I saw the original, and then on HBO around that time was Redux. So it was like,
It became the popular version. I mean, it was like...
Which is frustrating, because it's like, no, I want to watch the original. It's like we were
revisionist
talking about
history,
before
man.
we started recording about Star Wars. It's like, thank God the original of this still exists, so you can watch it.
Right.
But like Star Wars, you can't find the original version anywhere, the undoctored, redone version.
Right.
I mean,
So,
how much
thanks,
extra
Coppola.
is Redux?
So
49 minutes?
Time-wise. Okay, that's
Yeah.
a lot.
It is.
and like when this film is like it's on a short list of films that I want to see on the big screen.
Yes.
And just never could. But when Redux came out, I went to go see that,
Oh, it was released theatrically. I remember that. Yeah.
and like it was kind of half in, half out, because I'm like, I love that I get to see Apocalypse Now on the big screen, but I hate that I have to put up with all this because the extra stuff is just so
Unnecessary.
it's unnecessary, and it changes the tone of the whole film.
It's the reason you edit a film.
Yeah.
You leave the trimmings. It doesn't mean the trimmings aren't interesting,
Right.
but do they belong in the film?
Yeah.
You know?
The only thing, like there's a big sequence, probably the largest sequence that is in Redux is the sequence when they're going down the river and they come to this, it's like a bombed out French colony.
That's
and
from the novel.
Yes,
Yeah.
and they're like, they're the people that are sticking around and they still think the war is going on and all this. And it's interesting when you think about it as a deleted scene or as a short film, but though it's like, it's what happens after the chief dies and right before they reach Brando. So by the time you get to that sequence, you're like, ugh, like you have to suffer through such a long slog of stuff. It's probably 25 to 30 minutes of the 49 minutes that's in the film.
And there's a reason,
Well,
like you said,
yeah.
that it gets edited out, because it's like, and we grind to a halt, we change gears,
Right.
and then this has no bearing on what happens with Kurt.
Well, because they had the two stops, which were the Playmates performing, which had its own commentary, and then the where there was no superior officer, just soldiers shooting into the jungle. So it's like that was enough. I don't think you need
Anything
that
else.
whole,
And the Playmates, they had a whole probably 10-minute sequence after that where Martin Sheen arranges that the other soldiers can have sex with the Playmates. And it's interesting that John Milius there's a great interview on this on the Blu-ray between Milius and Coppola, and he's like, this is the Odyssey, and Kilgore is the Cyclops, and the Playmates are the
sirens. Yeah.
And it's like, you can't touch a siren. If you touch a siren, then you're dead.
Right.
So I never liked that was
see.
even shot. But so, and I love that the writer's reasoning behind why something shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
And probably should have never been in there in the first place.
And it's his story, so in my opinion, as a writer as well, you should always default to what the writer thinks. Yes, it's the director's vision and all of that other stuff, or the producers may find it and are making it, but in the end, the director wrote this, or the writer wrote this. So
yes,
let them have that story.
Yes and no, only because Milius's original ending involved Kurt's recruiting Willard to help him in an effort to thwart this air attack on it. Basically, Coppola said it was like a G.I. Joe ending, and he did not want that to be the last feeling that you had watching the film.
And it's that, and it's like, because yes, it is yes and no. Because barring that one instance with the sirens, like I do think this is a good hand-in-hand relationship between a writer and a director. But at a certain point, Coppola was like, I'm leading this film to something else.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're going down this path, and if I just end it like, you know, a bridge on the River Kwai, bridge too far type of big jingoistic ending, like I'm not being truthful to what
it's you know, it's an adaptation of Heart of Darkness too, and that it can't be forgotten because it's interesting because in the book Kurtz is dying and he is not killed by Marlowe. It is just, it's one of those things that happens, and then Marlowe goes to see his wife and lies to her about his last words. It's a different end, but it's like, it very much involves, I mean, it's in the ending of Apocalypse Now is in the same vein because he says, I want you to, if you understand me, then you will do this. You will tell my son about me. And I think that is, I think the way it ends is the spirit of the book, Heart of Darkness, and I think that was important to Coppola, even though it became kind of a mutant of its own,
Yeah.
separate from it, or a hybrid.
I mean, when you look at the production of this movie and the fact that it was supposed to be 6 weeks and it was 16 months, and they're shooting in the Philippines, and you know they're using the Philippines military helicopters, but there would be times when the government had to take the helicopters back because they were fighting militants within the country. And all of this crazy stuff is going on, and they shoot like 125,000 feet of film or some insane amount of just like hours and hours and hours and hours of film. Eventually, you are going to lose the thread of even the script that you're working on because you're like, what are we even doing now? I don't even remember. So that when you get to post-production, you almost have to rewrite the movie because we have so much. I don't know where to go. And then they added in all of Martin Sheen's voiceovers in post-production because so much of the audio was useless because of the helicopter noise. And like the movie that this was when it started and the movie that it ended up being are completely different from each other almost.
That's where I think the brilliance of the editing comes into play.
Oh, yeah.
Because, I mean, Walter Murch, and also the two other editors, if you look at some of the movies that they were responsible for, I mean, it's pretty remarkable. You've got Gerald Greenberg, French Connection, Taking of Pelham, Kramer versus Kramer. I mean, the list is really impressive, and you've got the other one as well. It's just interesting. Godfather of Three, Children of a Lesser God, right stuff. I mean, but you've got there's just so much involved in the editing of this film. It's very clear that.
And there's so much, like not just the editing, but the sound design of the whole film.
Revolutionary.
That's Walter Murch as well.
Yeah.
Right.
And it completely changed the way film sounded, and it completely changed the way like you can think of how a film can begin, what you can do to, like the way Coppola, he took this script and he said, okay, here are the plot points I've got to hit. As long as I hit those plot points, I can go off on, like I can have a thing where I'm just looking at the lost footage that's on the ground. I can pull up one and I've got B-roll of trees and all of a sudden they blow up. And it's like I'm looking at that and it's like, oh, that's the beginning of my movie. And maybe I can put on this song that I like that I'm listening to.
From my friend Jim Morrison.
Well, and did you know, so like the line, all the children are insane, is the last line you hear before it bleeds into this shot of the helicopter. You hear the helicopters, and then it's very interesting because there's a line later on when they're actually get to Kurtz where Dennis Hopper's character says these are all his children, and it was like it was definitely tied together.
Yeah.
You know, it was. Did you see The Rain People? So like the opening sequence reminded me of the experimental quality of the cinematography in that movie, the way he revealed things about characters using different experimental editing, and that opening shot of Martin Sheen's face upside down and the spinning ceiling fan while you're hearing a helicopter's propeller. I mean, it was like it just shows you how much you can reveal about a character with interesting use of imagery, you know?
And that experimental opening, it makes the ending reasonable.
Right.
As much as it's a descent into madness, and as many people think that the ending of this film doesn't live up to the film that came before it. I don't, but some people do. But that opening experimental montage and like the information that he is able to communicate through it, like you get like, okay, I'm in the mind of someone who has been to this crazy place, this crazy war, and he's wrestling with it. So
and you need to know that about him before he goes on this journey, because he says that he basically says he was given the mission because of his sins. Yeah. It's like to pay for his sins. So it's like that's very important information. Oh my God, there's too many, honestly.
We could have an entire episode just talking about the great lines from this film, and then another one about the shots, and then about the sound editing, and then about the synthesizer score. Like this movie, for what a crazy mess it is close to perfect.
But that's why what's left on. But that's why what is left on the celluloid is what is important. That no matter how big of a mess a production is, it's what you. It's like what goes into a painting. Yeah. You don't. I mean, it's interesting to know about the hell that someone went through,
the wall
that
behind
Van Gogh went through. Right. But to see the finished piece is its own.
And that's the difference between. It would be one thing if you had. If it was any other director or any other writer, that would be one thing. It would just be a mess. But then you've got these people that just know, like, okay.
Well, like Vincent Gallo's Brown Bunny, for instance. It's just like, you know what I mean? That it's like, no, Coppola was able to check his ego, and he wasn't known for having a big ego. And it's like for him to like kind of rein it in and say this is what's best for the film.
I watched the DVD version, and it's a 2-disc, which is just mean. It's such a mean way that they put that together.
That's why I had to upgrade to Blu-ray. I'm like, you're not going to do this to me.
Disc 1 is part 1 of the original film and part 1 of Redux. So they make you buy the 2 thing because they split the movie up in such a way. Yeah. So I only watched some of the supplemental stuff on the second disc, but it was all about the editing and the sound editing. And it was refreshing to me watching those like post-production meetings that they were having where the editors were really just standing up for themselves and what they were doing, and standing up to Coppola and being like, this is why we're doing it this way. And Coppola's like, well, what about this? And he's like, that doesn't work. And I've, I have never seen that side of post-production where people are standing up to the director, because I really only know, like from the Star Wars featurettes, we're all just like, yes, George, and then they look scared.
Well, there were so many talented people working on the film.
He had
that's
an
the thing.
amazing team.
It's like we talked about Night of the Hunter. You know, I mean, it's a similar type thing.
And like if you watch Hearts of Darkness and clearly that documentary has Eleanor Coppola has her hand in it in terms of like manipulating the footage and the narrative of the documentary. Yeah. But there's still like it always makes me cringe like when there's a shot of Coppola and he's like doing some interview on the set, and he's like I want to make the biggest, trashiest, like Irwin Allen disaster picture that I can make, and you hear that and you're like,
what?
Really? That's not the movie. That's not you. That's not the movie you want to make. Yeah. And it's so. Like, I feel like, thank God he had those editors that were able to say, like, no, Francis, like, you're not in your right state of mind. Like, let us help you. We know what your vision is. Let us help you see your vision. Right. And, whether that's the case or not, the film speaks for itself. But he was so open to it. Like, I love learning about the way Coppola works with the script, works with the actors, and then just, he says he went to the set and the only thing that he had was a little copy of the book of Hearts of Darkness. And he's like, the script I threw away because I knew what the scenes were. I just wanted to stick to the book as much as possible and get as much of the book and the feeling of the book in it. And he was just so open to so many different things, including the ending, which apparently came from Dennis Hopper, which is crazy.
I'm always interested in when people are reading books in movies. I'm always interested in what it means. And Frederick Forrest's performance, by the way, was one of the best in the film. And, his character was just so interesting because I thought it resembled the way a lot of people would be that were not necessarily gung-ho about being in the war, because his reactions to things were very real. When he had the freak out after the tiger, he's just like, I just wanted to cook. I just wanted, you know, I think a lot of people went through that.
Yeah.
And so he's reading Sexist by Henry Miller, and I just thought it was interesting that I just got to find real quick, if I can. It might be harder than I
took
thought.
2 note cards
Please-
and notes.
please
How
talk.
many pages does he have here? man?
Okay, so he's reading Sexist, right? Written in 1949, part of a trilogy called the Rosy Crucifixion Trilogy. And the Rosy Crucifixion name for the trilogy came from one of his last lines in his book, Tropic of Capricorn, where he says, all my cavalries were rosy crucifixions, pseudo-tragedies to keep the fires of hell burning brightly for the real sinners who are in danger of being forgotten. I just think it's, I can't see it just being like, read that.
Right.
It didn't happen. There's no way. It's just too perfect of a film to have that be arbitrary, in my opinion.
And then Willard has books on his, in the opening. He has some books on there too. I can't remember what they are, but I'm sure that they have meaning to him too. And even the name of the officer that supplied the narration. What's his name?
Michael Herr?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who co-wrote Full Metal Jacket,
Right.
which is interesting.
Right. Not even getting into the fact that this movie addresses a war that at the time in 1979, you know, people were either vehemently against or, you know, there was still a little shred of patriotism left for sticking behind why we were there. But for the most part, the consensus was, you know, we don't need to be here, and I can't believe we're still here.
Yeah.
And this film is very interesting because, you know, there's so many. I've heard from different veterans that they don't think of this film as a true war film because it doesn't, like, they think of it as almost like a slap in the face.
Right.
But I think there's something about a war film that has a little bit of a reverence that is seen from an outsider's perspective and addresses the fact that there's soldiers that don't want to be there.
Yeah.
And maybe that is the best way to kind of get at the heart of what the feeling of true war is. Because I do consider this a war film, and it might be even one of the best war films.
Yeah.
It's my favorite war film. I mean, I think it's a study of some of the hypocrisies of war within the limits of their necessity. So I think he's acknowledging the necessity of war in certain cases, but I don't think he considered this war a necessary one.
Right.
I think it was a condemnation of, he has the line about, after the Playmates, he says, well, Charlie, his idea of R&R is eating rat meat, and he basically says that there's these 4-star clowns who are about to give the whole circus away. And there are so many lines that underline the hypocrisy. When Kilgore calls the woman with the grenade, he says, bleeping savages. And it's like, you mean the people, like, it looked like a school.
Yeah.
You mean the people that you just bombed? Do you mean that
So
tried
that you
to
can serve.
defend themselves? Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, he has a code, and they're very important. He says he protects that Vietnamese guy. He says, you know, he's like, any man who's going to strap his guts, who's going to fight, who's brave enough to fight with his guts strapped to him, can drink from my canteen anytime he wants. It's like,
And then doesn't give him a chance. There's so many moments of that, like, where you're like, yes, and then they don't follow through.
Right.
And
That's one of the
have to know that they're intentional.
One of the best, most awful laughs, because you
Yeah.
can't help but want to laugh, but then you feel bad because you're laughing at what you're laughing at.
Yeah.
But yeah, totally. Like, and I think that ties into the perfect marriage between a writer and a director, because John Milius knows the the intricacies of the military. You know, he's a very pro-war person, or at least, you know, that's what he projects in his image. But he loves writing that way, and he loves getting those awesome lines that just get to the heart of how a person can be so joyfully, gleefully abhorrent. And, you know, Kilgore is a perfect example in that whole sequence. I mean, other than the fact that it's one of the greatest action sequences ever assembled.
It's incredible.
But that his whole character and the way he is charted through that whole sequence, I mean, not only is it a reference to the Odyssey and to the Cyclops, but it's almost like he's like the perfect character that represents the Vietnam War.
Well, because he said he had that, and he also said he had that weird light around him, where you just knew this guy was going to leave here without a scratch. But then also that he loved his boys, and that he would do and that you felt safe around him. It's a very panoramic way of looking at humans and not just painting them.
You want to know more about his backstory to how he got to that place where he is so comfortable.
He's the only one who didn't duck for cover.
Yeah, every time. And it's mind-boggling to think that those are just career military guys, and that's just how they operate.
Yeah.
During all of this firefight, during all of this stuff, there's a flare that gets in their helicopter. Like, all of this is going on, and the whole time it's just like, Lance, look at those waves. See how they split? So they just break?
And even Lance, it's after a while, he's just like, I think we should wait for the tide. Like, he was annoyed.
Yeah.
He was like, listen, man, but then
I'm being
he goes
shot
off
at.
on his own thing.
He's like, all right, then bring in the napalm.
It's such madness. And John Milius has, in the interview, he talks about, he's like, with the films that he was thinking about, like, obviously he wanted to make his Heart of Darkness, but he was thinking about films like The Bridge on the River Kwai. But he also said, you know, it was also around this time that Dr. Strangelove came out. And he's like, I wanted to have that type of reverence, and I wanted to address a true event and you know, showcase it for the madness that it is. And that whole sequence is all about that. And I never would have, watching this film, I never would have thought of Dr. Strangelove, but hearing him say it, I'm like, oh my God, that makes so much sense.
This is the non-comedic Dr. Strangelove.
You know, when you get to the heart of Kurtz's madness, which is sort of courted by Willard throughout, you know, the film, you realize that, yes, he did. They make many references to he broke from himself, freedom from the opinions of others as well as your own, all this stuff. But he has a great respect for the enemy, because he talks about it. He says the only way we would have won this is if we had. He tells the story about the chopping off of the limbs, the indoctrinated, he talks about how these weren't monsters. These were men filled with love, who were able to make those decisions. And I just think he came face to face with truth, and he could no longer. I mean, it's a profound analysis of the human condition. It goes beyond war, to be honest. And that's which Conrad was an expert at. So I think it's just great.
It is interesting when you were talking about that. You think of this like as the ultimate war film. War's kind of just the backdrop of it, though. Like, it's so much more about the psychology of man and just like what happens to you when you're in these extreme situations. And meanwhile, the Vietnam War is happening also. And you know, once we get onto the boat and we're going up and we're dealing with all that, we're kind of getting removed a little bit from the conflict, but it's always still right there. It's always right behind us.
You remember when they get lulled into like a false sense of security when they're reading the letters, and then thereby we do. Yeah. We're like, oh, man, we're listening, and he says this is Lance says refers it to. He's like, this is our Disneyland. This is better than Disneyland. Yep. And then what happens? Mr. Clean gets killed, and then. Like, you hear the voiceover of his mother talking. It's like very, I mean, it's very such a carefully crafted moment, because then the colors turn blue, and then you hear this jazz note, which you hadn't heard the entire film while they're giving him his funeral, basically in the water. I mean, it's.
And yeah, like watching it last night, like you feel the kills in this.
Maybe more so than
much.
any war film,
Right?
Well, it's like Peckinpah. Every time someone died in a Peckinpah film, you felt it. It wasn't gratuitous. It was, even though they were slow. I feel like he did the slow-mo for a reason.
So you could have that
really
last moment with him and be like, oh no.
Yep.
When was the first time you saw it? I know we got right into this.
I can't remember if it was high school or college.
Yeah.
It might have been in high school when I was going through the AFI list with my teacher, Mr. Schnapp, or it was freshman year of college when I found it somewhere. Like I had, for the first time in my life, I had access to a Blockbuster, so I was just there constantly. And friend of the show, Kyle Anderson, and I used to go and just get movies constantly. So it had to have been then, because when did Redux come out? It was like late 90s, right?
Yeah, I think it was 2000 or 2001. 2000.
Then I would have still been in high school when it was originally like presented to me as something that I could be watching.
Yeah.
But I don't think I saw it until college.
I think I was like 19. I had graduated high school, and I was in this phase of watching a lot like Kubrick and all these movies.
Like we
thinking
do.
thinking I was a film student.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
I was watching all the big ones, and
You were an independent film student.
right? And I remember seeing this, and I appreciate. I loved it, but there's no way I could have appreciated it the way I did.
This
yesterday
is
when I
certainly a
saw it.
film that you watch young, think is cool, and then the further you get into your life, because we're all about the age of Martin Sheen's character in the film. He celebrated his 36th birthday on the set, so we're all right around then. So I definitely think that we have a much different perspective now than we did when we were 19,
I mean,
20.
he was going through his own stuff during filming. He had a heart attack?
He had a heart
if I'm not
attack.
mistaken?
He was dealing with
and I believe
alcoholism.
that moment was real when
Yep.
he
Punched
punched
the
the
mirror.
Yep, and
Real
wiped
blood.
the blood.
Real
I mean,
The crew was like, Francis, we have to stop. And he's like, no, it's good, it's good.
of course.
And they show like he actually got drunk during the scene, and then it's in the documentary. But like Francis Ford Coppola is up there, and he's like, he's like, I wanted to Martin Sheen is a very vain person. I wanted to touch that. And he's like, hey, look at how pretty you are in the mirror. Look at your pretty nose and everything. And he just like went off, and he punches the mirror, and he has the blood and everything, and then it goes on even more, and like he's like yelling at Francis Ford Coppola. It's crazy. Do you guys remember Columbia House?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So during the time of the AFI list, so my friend and I, Eric, we're going down the list, and he kept on wanting to watch this, and I kept pushing it away. I don't know why, but I was pushing it away.
Same reason I've still never seen Schindler's List.
I don't want to feel that
I
much.
own it. I don't know that I want to watch that.
Schindler's List.
I know.
But Columbia House came out, and I was taking advantage of it, and he's like, hey, get me Apocalypse Now. It'll only cost you a penny. Here's a penny. And I did it. I gave it to him. He watched it that night, and I'm like, can I watch it? Can we watch it like next week or something? And he's like, yeah, no, because when you watch it, you're going to want it back. And then we watched it, and I'm like, yeah, I want it back.
Give me that, please.
But yeah, same thing. It's like, you're awestruck by it, but watching it last night, I'm like, it's still deep.
Yeah.
Edit point. 28 minutes.
Yeah.
It's just,
I try not to just like search for symbolism. I try to like just experience a film. But when there's moments when I'm like, this is clearly saying something. There's that moment when they're going through the whole Kilgore sequence when all of a sudden Coppola wants you to focus on this bleating sheep that's being hoisted through the air while a chaplain is administering some sort of prayer to this group of soldiers. And it just really felt like the innocence and better nature of these soldiers was being sacrificed for something else that's rooted in darkness, And it's there were tons of moments like that throughout the film, but I just was always very impressed.
yeah. The whole sequence with the when they get to the boat and then the puppy.
Yes, they cared more about that puppy's life than any human on board.
Yeah.
Because they did not see them as human, and it's part of that stripping down of the enemy and dehumanizing the enemy. And I mean, Lance had the puppy in his
jacket.
His jacket.
Yeah. There's so many moments
one of my
in
favorite
this.
scenes in the movie.
So many moments in the movie where you can kind of put yourself back in that time and kind of see the prejudice that a lot of people would have had when, like, they fly in and they're just gunning these people down, and then the girl throws a grenade and they're just like, oh, how could she? And it's like, well, let's think about it for a second, guys. You just come in with a herd of helicopters and destroy everything. For what purpose? To take the beach? Why? What did these people do? Why are you? That's something that I can never get my head around in regards to war, when it's always the civilians that are being killed. And you see very few Viet Cong in this film at all. It's pretty much just either shooting into the jungle, tracers coming out at you, or murdering civilians.
Go ahead.
Well, and that's almost a way. That's almost a way that this film addresses Vietnam better than any other Vietnam film, because look, that's what they're feeling. Like they don't see the enemy, they don't understand the enemy, they don't know what the enemy, who the enemy is. So they're really just firing at anything that they think is they're scared kids.
Which is it's interesting because it's in Heart of Darkness. Early on in the journey, Marlowe is like, "What are you firing at?" They're just firing into the jungle. They don't see an enemy, and it's just like he can't understand it, and so it's just interesting that it's always kind of been that way. And it's just Vietnam was just another.
And how many times do we have the guys on the boat just opening fire on something, and the officers not being able to control them? Like when they murder the people on the boat, I mean, that boat's gonna sink in like 5 minutes.
I mean,
he
could have shot Frederick Forrest. For God's sake.
Right.
I mean, he was crouching. You know, I think it's before they even get to Kilgore, but it's like you can see the lack of respect for culture and xenophobia when they're going by the two fishermen and they just like knock them over and they're like laughing. It's so American. It's so just like, we don't care.
We even have a radio announcement early in the film when they're saying the mayor of Hanoi is asking you to not hang your laundry outside.
That's right.
To better preserve Hanoi.
Right.
And it's like, of course, imperialist white guys just come in, they're like, nope, we hang our laundry outside, and that's how we're going to do it here. And it's like, good.
Well, and they don't even have a respect for each other, to be honest, because when that one boat is passing them of American soldiers, they light the top of their boat on fire.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like a complete disregard for any kind of
Funny prank, guys.
decency. I mean, yeah.
It's high school boys on spring break in another country where they can drink and do drugs and screw around and do everything that they want to do. And the only real consequence is you're probably going to get killed. But if you push that far enough back in your mind, then hey, let's just drink and smoke and do acid and do all this other stuff. It's a very strong commentary on the pointlessness of that conflict. And that's why I don't see it so much as a war film as a film that happens with a war backdrop. Because for me, my favorite war film is probably Saving Private Ryan. It's the one I've seen the most.
It's a great one.
It's the most effective for me. I remember seeing it in the theater, and that was probably the first war film I saw in the theater with surround sound and everything shaking and all of that. That, to me, is a war movie because it's about people surviving in a war, whereas this is a psychological journey into the heart of darkness in the setting of Vietnam.
I almost think of like with war films, it's so like each war has its movie that is the best representation of that particular war.
Right.
So it's like, you know, for me, it's like Saving Private Ryan and Apocalypse Now don't have anything in common.
Right. Because they're
just
different
two
wars.
different wars.
Yeah.
But that maybe the way Americans went to another country and just took it over and had no regard for it is that a movie calls itself a Vietnam War movie, but doesn't want to have anything to do with, like, you know, with the war itself and putting it in the backdrop and putting the people of it in a backdrop. You know, maybe that's the best way to
You almost
represent the war.
can't make a Vietnam War film like a war film, like a regular war film.
Because it was different.
Because there was just way more going on.
And just the total destruction of everything. Like, even in the making of this film, there's questionable practices that they did simply because they were in the Philippines and they could.
Right.
Like, when they light the forest on fire, they actually did that. They used like hundreds of gallons of gasoline and they burned down a friggin' forest. And it's like, guys, this is just a movie.
Right.
You know that, right? And the water buffalo scene, the sacrifice scene, they filmed that. That's an actual thing.
Yeah.
And there's discrepancies as to whether or not it was like, oh, we just witnessed it and rolled camera, or we facilitated it and gave them animals to sacrifice. And that's when you have to look at Coppola and go, that's too much.
You know, Herzog always
Too much.
flirted with that sort of, you know, I mean, there's stories about how he told these villagers that they could, the natives, that they could kill Kinski after, I think it was Aguirre.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, you know, you're playing with fire, you know, and
And Coppola said that was, like, he looked to that film while he was making this.
really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. But I just thought of something because we were talking about, it's interesting that, because this film was after Coming Home, and then The Deer Hunter, and then this, and it's like the three big films about Vietnam, probably the first, I believe the first three films to address Vietnam, and they all have nothing really to do with the war itself. You know, Coming Home is about, you know, what happens to the effects of people that come home from the war. The Deer Hunter is, you know, the same thing. You know, that's probably like a, you know, half-hour sequence in that almost 4-hour film.
Right. It's got a whole
That has
hour
a
of
war.
exposition before we even get to
Right.
that. Yeah.
And then this, but, you know, this to me, out of those three films, as much as I love Coming Home and The Deer Hunter, you know, this film always felt like, especially watching it last night, like maybe it says more about Vietnam and about the psychology of people that went to Vietnam better than any other film that's come out.
Well, and Vietnam was also the first conflict that we were in that we were having to be cognizant of PTSD and shell shock. I mean, we had shell shock from the world wars and stuff like that, but this was the big one because these were really young kids who were coming back changed and they were coming back and they weren't saying, yeah, buy war bonds, let's help our boys. They were coming back and saying, this is pointless,
Right.
stop.
Well, they're
And I
coming
think-
home and people calling them baby killers.
Yeah.
You know, and you know,
When you
whatever
don't feel
else.
supported as a guy on the ground, then when you come back, it's going to be a very different thing than just like, oh, thanks for saving us from the Nazis. People are coming back and calling you baby killers, and it's like,
Where do I go?
yeah,
know-
what do I do?
Touching on Kurtz and his whole, I feel like he wasn't so much condemning the war effort as just he talks about the morality of lies, and he talks about, there's a line in Hearts of Darkness where Marlowe says, which is Willard, says, I hate, detest, and can't bear a lie, not because I'm straighter than the rest of us, but simply because it appalls me. There's a taint of death, a flavor of mortality in lies, which is exactly what I hate and detest in the world, what I want to forget. It makes me miserable and sick, like biting something rotten. And that hatred of lies is incorporated into the film twofold, because Sheen has a line about hating lies, and then Kurtz has a whole line about that, and it's pretty much that the war was a big lie.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got to be the way they feel in this 17-year war we have in Iraq and Afghanistan, okay? It's like you were sold a lie. It doesn't have the social justice of a World War II or, you know, or
Right.
the, you know, I mean, just the way the Civil War kind of erupted based on a clash of ideals. You can't really understand it in that sense. It
Right.
seems like it arose out of just a back room of people who had an agenda. And I think that's a lot of that is at the heart of it.
Yeah,
It's a plan that was concocted by people sitting in a room eating shrimp.
yeah.
You know, I think it's in All Quiet on the Western Front where they talk about why can't it just be two generals who go and like fight each other.
Right.
Right. Why does it have to be
Fist
the
to
whole
fist.
thing?
What about all these people that are fight the war for them?
Right.
You know, or it just doesn't make sense. It seems like a big waste because none of these people have anything to do with what these two people had. We're
Exactly.
talking about, you know.
But speaking of Kurtz, we haven't even really touched on Brando yet. That could have been its own like documentary just about Brando and Coppola working together on this film, or not working together, as it probably ended up being, where Coppola offers him the role, and he's like, you know, it's based on this book, and he gets $1 million advance, and then he threatens to not show up and just keep the advance, and like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Doesn't read the script, doesn't learn his lines, shows up like 80 pounds overweight. I read that a lot of it, they came to butting heads so much that a lot of it ended up getting directed by the second unit director because Coppola was just like, I can't, I'm not going to do it. But we still get this incredible performance from Brando. And we were talking about it, I think even before you got here, that at what point does method acting get in the way of everyone doing their job? And we talked about it with Pacino and, you know, Dustin Hoffman and all these guys that are super, super method in their acting. Meanwhile, there's grips and there's electricians and there's catering and all these other people who are just trying to get through their day, and you won't let them because you decided last night that the character actually lives in a dream and he's a butterfly, he's about to emerge, and everybody's like, will you just shut up and say your lines? This is a 14-hour day. Just let us go home. So as the performer, as the person on set, that would be unbelievably frustrating for me. But also as the performer, it sounds kind of freeing and kind of interesting to like get into that character so far. But then the other director hat is looking at the clock, thinking about how much money we're losing by you futzing around being a crazy person.
It's weird because I always think, like, hearing the stories of what he went through, it's like, what is the limit? And is it a case by case? Is it just the fact that Coppola knew that, just based on working with him in The Godfather, that you know there's something here? You know, I know he has his own ego and his own personality.
I mean, he used cue cards in that. He had a cue card on an orange, a cue card on a, you know, and he didn't want to memorize his lines in that movie either.
And it's like, what's the, like, when do you say, like, okay, this is enough?
That's my question.
It's like,
Because I know at this point in my career, I'm not Marlon Brando, I'm not anybody to anybody, but if I showed up on a film set and I was just like, I don't want to memorize my lines, I want to use cue cards, I would be fired.
The thing is, I think that Brando is that good. Okay, Brando is one of the top 3 actors of all time, in my opinion, based on what he brings to the table. And I'm not saying that it justifies the breach of conduct, but he is that good. And Kurtz is one of the toughest characters to ever portray in the history of anything. Sorry, it's to get to that level of a disconnection from your own self, and it goes beyond insanity. It's like, I don't know.
It's also too like I'm wondering how much of it is kind of like an Andy Kaufman thing, where it's like, you know, are we just buying into the myth, or is it something that actually happened?
Right.
You know, did Coppola show up and be like, oh, I know this is the way he works. He's just, you know, he's screwing with me just to screw with me, but he will, you know,
I mean,
arrive.
Was a lot of his dialogue improvised?
Most of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like if a director's okay with that, and a writer's okay with that, and you understand the character and the circumstances, I loved the way he started talking to Willard. When he said, oh, where are you from? He said, Ohio. He's like, there's a river. He basically says, I've been on the river that runs by the town you grew up in.
Right.
I'm now at the end of this river, and it's metaphorical. It's like, and whether, I don't know,
and he's got like, he knows that in his head. Like,
There's certainly no denying he knows Kurtz inside and out.
Right.
Because he created it from nothing. because he didn't.
Because he did that to himself.
He made it up. But that's where social justice warrior Lincoln Hayes steps up and is like, you have a director and you have a screenwriter, and you have a novelist who have told you what you're supposed to be doing.
Right.
If you want to make up a character, that's not for now. That's not for right now. That's the pre-production process. That's working with the writer and the director and figuring all that out. But to just show up on the day, 80 pounds overweight, completely wrong for what they had in mind for you.
Though. He said he did remember something. I remember reading that he did remember something in Hearts of Darkness about the character being bald. So
so he shaved his head.
Yeah. In the documentary, it goes that he's given him all this trouble. Like, he's not reading it. He keeps like going to him and saying, "Please, you got to read this book."
Yeah.
Like, this
it's not even that long. It's
right.
like 100 pages.
It's a novel.
Yeah.
But then at one point, like, he came in and he had shaved his head, and he's like, because he was before that he was saying, "I'm not going to shave my head. Like, I'm not doing that."
Okay.
So he comes in, his head is shaved, and he's like, "What happened?" And he's like, "Oh, I read the book, and I like this thing, and I think that we can do this." And he's like, "Why did you put me through all of that?"
I mean, Brando's he was a really smart guy. Like, he really was.
And that's the
he
trouble.
had
He's
an
too
intellect.
smart.
Like, and he liked to kind of act like he wasn't. Like, it was like, you know what I mean? And if you really kind of got to get to know, like, he understood a lot about humanity and about what makes people tick and all that.
You can't make up that dialogue, which it seems nonsensical. It seems like the ravings of a madman, but yet follows a path and follows a structure. And for me, it's like, with Coppola, it's like, as a director, I'm listening to this, I'm hearing this come out, and it's like, if I like it, I like it. I don't really care if it's
he could have stepped in and said, "You know what? It's not working for me, Marlon."
Right. But it was. That's the trouble. He is a genius.
Didn't he threaten to bring in Nicholson? I've got to look this up later, but I believe he did threaten him and say, "I can be on the phone with Jack Nicholson in a second." And I'm pretty positive that happened. And it's just interesting because it probably would have still been an incredible film. It would have been
so different, though.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Even with Harvey Keitel as Willard, which almost happened.
Yep.
And Nick Nolte wanted it real bad too. This
always
is
interesting.
pre-brain injury, obviously, but
But with the Brando stuff, like, and it is at the point where Coppola is, he's got his hands up in the air and he's saying, like, the ending that I have written is not going to work. I know it's not going to work, so I don't know what else to do. And then, he's talking with Dennis Hopper, who is a crazy person. And,
God, he's so good.
He's on the documentary, like, he's talking to Dennis Hopper off set, and Dennis Hopper is talking like Dennis Hopper talks, and he's like, he's going crazy, and he's making up all this stuff, and he's talking like his character in the movie. And Coppola's just like, "Why aren't you doing this in the movie? Like, why just talk like this?"
Do that.
And he's like, "Oh, okay." And he's like, because at first he's like, "You're not reading the lines." It's like, I've already forgotten the lines. He's like, "Yeah, but you haven't read the lines. It doesn't make any sense if you've forgotten the lines that you haven't even read in the first place." And then he starts going off on these, like, little tangents, and he's like, "Do that."
What's so impressive?
I hired you, Dennis.
What's so impressive about a lot of this is that that's a character from the novella. I mean, it's
the photojournalist.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't necessarily but he was basically like the manager. He was like the guy that they met. All of that happens in the book, and it's like, for them to take a lot of that source material and be able to, it may be the best modernizing and kind of retooling of basic parts during an adaptation that I've ever seen, because it's all justified. It all makes so much sense. It's inspiring. It sort of makes you want to go and look for novels that are dust off that, find some unexplored novel and say, how can we modernize this and still retain its most essential elements that are just...
That was actually encouraged at the Story Labs that I went to a few years ago. One of the guys who's a successful screenwriter, he's like, find a story that you like, contact the author or the publisher, see if you can option it for a year, adapt it, and see if you can sell it.
Well, and how many novels are in the public domain?
Yeah,
there's tons from the 1800s. Just find a good story.
Find a story and see what's the root of it, what's the through line, how can I make this modern day?
Yeah.
Speaking of Dennis Hopper, I read that he really annoyed Marlon Brando to the point where he like knew that he was, so he would intentionally antagonize him, to the point where Brando refused to shoot any scenes with him. And in the scene where he throws the book at him, those were shot separately. But when he yells "you mutt" at him, or he like grumbles it at him, at least the person on IMDb who wrote this was like, he probably meant that. It's like, well, yeah. Dennis Hopper is the other end of that, of like crazy, over animated, like intense actors. But he seems to be more aware of how it affects people around him so that he can adjust it. Whereas Brando is a genius. And when you are at that level of genius, you kind of lose your social awareness. Yep. To the point where you do show up on set and you're like, this is how I'm going to do it to make your movie the best it's going to be.
Yep. And that's why you hire those people and you roll the dice and say, which Marlon Brando am I going to get? I don't know, but is this the reason I got him in the first place?
Right.
You know, because he could make it that much more brilliant, you know?
I think Dennis Hopper is the unsung hero of this movie. Like, I don't think enough people that...
I forgot he was in it.
He and Robert Duvall, I wrote in caps, perfectly cast next to both of them. And it didn't mean Sheen wasn't well cast or any of the players. But something about the way you're introduced to Duvall's character and how he plays it, he is that guy.
Yeah.
And he's just so cool.
And Dennis Hopper's the same thing.
The coolest guy in this movie.
Right.
And then you're like, well, you're kind of a horrible person. But still, this is pretty cool.
But then Dennis Hopper, the same thing. He embodies that character. And I think a lot of it had to do with what you said, which I didn't know, which is that Coppola was like, just do it the way you're talking to me now. Yeah. That's the character. Or it's going to be, you know?
And then out of those things, Dennis Hopper says, oh, this is like, you know, it's like the Sun King, you know, the king has to be killed and then that person takes over for the king. And he's like, oh, that's the end of my movie.
I love the, there's so many iconic things in this, like Duvall's 2 lines about Charlie Don't Surf and Napalm in the Morning, all that. But the moment, for me, imagery-wise, is Martin Sheen's camouflaged face rising out of the water. And then I think it's the same shot turning to see Brando's silhouette in the doorway, knowing he's about to die and walking back in. It's like, I mean, it's truly amazing. It's one of those unforgettable moments.
There's so much imagery in this movie. This movie that is just like it's like Lawrence of Arabia, or you know, The Last Emperor, or even like There Will Be Blood. It's like it's on a list of movies where it's like I don't know how the F they made it.
I think Storaro shot a lot of Bertolucci's films, to be honest. The Conformist. I mean, so a lot he was familiar with epic scope, you know.
And I love, like, I thought of the Conformist too, because I love that it has such a simple, straight line of a person is hired to assassinate another person, and they've got a journey to find that person. And then it's like, it's so, the structure is already worked out for you, and all you have to do is just kind of plot the points for him.
You just made me realize that Looper may have been, in a way, an adaptation of Heart of Darkness, because it's basically being sent back to kill yourself. It's I mean, essentially an assassin to kill an assassin, and finding out that really it's like, wait a minute. He has that line about, if this is the way Kilgore fights war, then there's got to be more involved than murder and insanity in telling me to go kill this guy. Because that's just, you can find that anywhere here, you know? It's like,
there's also the whole thing about how he joined Airborne when he was 38 years old, and the fact that, like, why would he do that? Like, why would he, you know, he gave up so much. Like, he gave up his whole trajectory as an officer to do that.
Well, because if he hadn't achieved heroism, the downfall wouldn't have been so dramatic.
Right.
I mean,
there's so much in this.
Let's do some trivia before we're out of time here. So we talked about Pacino already. Coppola wanted him for Willard, and he turned it down, saying, "You're going to be up in the helicopter, and I'm going to be down in the swamp for 5 months." That's part of why he turned it down. And Coppola also commented on it and said, if we had shot it in his apartment in New York City, he would have done the movie. Dennis Hopper got a 14-year-old Lawrence Fishburne addicted to heroin while making this film.
he was 14?
14. He lied about his age.
God, he was so good.
Wasn't he? Lied about his age. So
He was
could be in this
perfectly
movie.
cast too, if you think about just what he brought to that character.
The first scene was unscripted. We talked about that. Martin Sheen punch in the mirror. The 6-week shoot took 16 months, and there was nearly 200 hours of footage. What does that say? Well, the canteen scene. We talked about that with the guy holding in his guts. Based on an actual occurrence, the line that he says, any man who can hold in his guts can
Right.
drink from my canteen. An actual soldier said that.
Nice.
Brando improvised his 18-minute speech, which only 2 minutes of it made it into the final cut of the film. And when he was done, he turned to Coppola and said, "Francis, this is all I have. If you don't have it, I can't do anything else for you." That's insane.
There's one in The Heart of Darkness where he's talking and then all of a sudden he's just like, I just ate a bug.
So good.
Man's crazy. Coppola lost 100 pounds during filming. Robert Duvall's Academy Award nominated performance is only 8 minutes of screen time. Coppola asked his good friend Roger Corman for advice on shooting in the Philippines, and he just said, "Don't go." I already talked about the water buffalo slaughter being real, which still unnerves me. We mentioned Charlie Sheen had a heart attack during the filming of the movie. Martin, excuse me. And
Charlie also did too. I'm just
Charlie was an extra, and Emilio played a messenger. But so that they wouldn't get in trouble with insurance and production and everything, they kept the heart attack quiet, and they flew out Joe Estevez, Martin Sheen's brother, to double for him. So there's a shot on the boat that's kind of far away that's him, and he does a couple of his voiceovers. You had mentioned pulling the opening scene out of the trash can. They were in the editing room, and he just happened to look over in a big trash can full of film, and he goes, "Well, what about this?" And that's the opening. This film essentially created 5.1 surround sound. They worked closely with the people at Dolby, who were just down the road, because at that time there was only the 4 channels, and they worked to create the 5th. They didn't review any footage while filming because Philippines didn't have any film processing. So everything that was shot was just shipped to the US, and he was just shooting everything blind, which explains why he had 2 hours of footage, because do we have a shot of a tree? I don't know. Get a shot of that tree.
Right.
Do we have this? Get
well,
that.
that's why you shoot for 16 months.
That's why you don't need to shoot for 16 months. Coppola plays the reporter
Yep, love that.
in that shot where he's
Don't
just
look at the
"Don't
camera.
look at the
This is for television.
It's like a meta moment.
It is a
Yeah.
meta moment, but he only did it because the actors didn't show up. So he's just like, well, I'll do it. Orson Welles submitted a script to RKO as an adaptation of Heart of Darkness in 1939, and they said it would be too expensive. What else do you got? And 2 years later, he submitted Citizen Kane.
And I believe he also wanted to read Heart of Darkness instead of War of the Worlds, but then selected War of the Worlds. I have a few things to throw in. Just Martin Sheen was 3rd billing.
Yeah.
Marlon Brando, Robert Duvall, Martin Sheen. That is a travesty.
Yeah.
That's all I'm going to say. I think it's
That's-
I think it's ridiculous.
That's lawyers and agents right there.
Yeah.
So.
Great film.
I wanted to say about Walter Murch, in addition to being one of the best editors of all time and a sound pioneer, he also wrote THX 1138 and wrote and directed Return to Oz. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah.
One of the most dynamic film personalities ever, if you think about it. I mean, that's crazy. Who's that well-rounded? I don't know many. I mean,
Two of the
That's my 2 cents.
documentaries on the second disc
And-
are mostly about him.
and edited Touch of Evil, which is, in my opinion, the best film of all time. And I believe it was his first editing credit. So,
Nailed it.
first time out the park.
If you haven't seen it, see it. It's close to a perfect film. It's madness the way that it was made, but like so many films that we talk about on this show, this crazy ragtag group of people throwing together these ideas, and they make an iconic film.
I mean, it's one of, like I said, like Lawrence of Arabia or Seven Samurai. It's like it's one of the most unbelievably how did they make it movies. Like you watch it and it's no matter where you are, like it's going to inspire awe in you.
Yeah.
And it's filmmaking on a completely different level. With that, I'm like I just don't get how they could get all the resources together to make that.
You know, originally in Heart of Darkness, The Filmmaker's Apocalypse, when I saw the part where Coppola at the press conference says, you want to know Vietnam? You want to see Vietnam? My movie is Vietnam.
Yeah.
It really was like, I didn't like it.
Yeah.
I think it's close to the truth. As far as this is as close as you're going to get to this experience. I mean.
Well, thank you, Devon, for coming on. We are out of time.
Thank you.
This movie was a long time
Yeah.
coming for us, and
Yeah.
it was a pleasure to have
So
you here.
thankful to be a part of this one. So
Next week we are off because I will be out of town, but David will be at Main Street Landing screening Wizard of Oz, which I am super jealous about.
Very excited. It's going to be fun. Bring the kids.
And then 2 weeks we're going to be doing The Treasure of Sierra Madre,
Yep.
which I'm excited about. Thank you again, Devon, for being on here.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, for picking such a great film for us. And thank you all for watching us talk about it. So until next time, I'm Lincoln L. Hayes.
David Metzger.
Devon Ewalt.
Go watch a movie, suckers.